Rolling installation of patches is really preferable. It is the best way of applying patches to your cluster because you don't take down the database. You can patch your infrastructure, but the database remains online. You can hide the outage from your users. Rolling patches is really cool. But in order to do it effectively, you must be able to drain your instances fairly quickly. If you have problems draining, then consider rolling in groups instead of a traditional rolling patch installation. I strongly recommend that you complete a rolling patch installation as soon as possible. When you start to work on the first instance, you should finish your work. You should finish patching the entire cluster as soon as possible. Ideally, you need to process all instances in your cluster within 24 hours. As soon as you start a rolling patch apply, it is marked in the cluster that it is in a rolling patch state. In rolling patch state, some of the really cool functionality in the cluster is disabled. Being in rolling patch state is still a supported state. The database will work. Your users can connect, no problems there. But we do disable some of the cool functionality in the cluster. So finish as soon as possible. We also need to touch a little upon draining. Draining is important when you need to patch grid infrastructure or when you need to patch a cluster. Imagine that the first instance in our cluster is going down for maintenance. You can then stop or relocate the services that are running on that instance. And when you do that, a fan event is sent out to the users that are connected to that instance. They are told that this instance is going down, finish your work, and then move to another instance. Idle connections or connections sitting there in the connection pool will immediately disconnect and reconnect to one of the other instances in the cluster. But an active user with a long-running transaction will have time to finish their work and then eventually, at a proper point in time, release that connection and reconnect again to one of the other instances. In this period, the scan listener knows that one instance is going down, so it'll assure that new connections is sent to one of the other instances in the cluster. When you create a service, either using SRvCTL or DBMS service, you can set a default drain timeout. So whenever something needs to happen with a service on one instance, then this default drain timeout is applied. I can set it to, for instance, 10 minutes. So when I stop a service, then the users will have, by default, 10 minutes to finish their work and move to another instance. Of course, if I need to do emergency maintenance, I can then override that default timeout if the situation warrants that. When you set drain timeout, either as a default drain timeout on the service or when you stop a service or relocate a service and you specify a drain timeout, don't set it too low. Don't set it to 5 or 10 seconds. Even though I told you to complete a rolling patch installation as soon as possible, by setting it too low, if you have an instance with hundreds or thousands of connections and they leave within a very short time period and connect to another instance, that can lead to a login storm. Set a higher drain timeout so the transition can happen more smoothly. But on the other end, don't set drain timeout too high, because if you do that and you have many nodes in your cluster, you will have your cluster in rolling patch state for an extended period of time. You really want to complete the rolling patch installation as soon as possible. Also, when you are in a rolling patch state, the cluster is not operating at full capacity because you have instances down for maintenance. So finish as soon as possible and don't set drain timeout too high. Generally, you should ensure that the application that connects to your cluster complies with the maximum availability architecture. When you go and look in the technical brief, it has some very detailed information on how you can configure your application. It has advice on how to create connection strings, creating and maintaining your services, and so forth. This is really the place to go when you need to configure your application in such a way that it works smoothly with cluster databases.